Good evening and welcome to a meeting of the Northampton School Committee, Thursday, May 27th, 2021. This meeting is being held as an
Recording in
online
progress.
Zoom meeting pursuant to Governor Baker's emergency order modifying the state's open meeting law. We will begin the meeting by asking our clerk to call the roll of the school committee.
Mayor Narkowitz,
Yes, present.
Member Busanski,
Present.
Member Fallon is not with us. Member Seraphy Cox is not with us. Member Condon,
Present.
Member Levy is not with us. Member Kaufman,
Present.
Member Goldman, Member Goldman,
Present.
Member
Present.
Voss,
Present.
and Member Gold.
Present.
Your Honor, you have a quorum.
Excellent, thank you. The next item on our agenda is a public comment period. Here's Member Levy. Is there anyone who wishes to speak in public comment? If you do, if you would raise your hand, your Zoom hand, using the reaction menu, or if you're calling in by telephone, using your star function, *6, I believe, to raise your hand. Is there anyone who wishes to speak in the public comment period? Okay, I do not see anyone. So I will now move on to the third item on our agenda, which is announcements. Are there any announcements from members of the school committee? Oh, I've got two hands up, Member Kaufman, and then Member Busanski first, and then Member Kaufman. Member Busanski.
Thank you. I just wanted to inform the committee and the community that I will not be running for re-election. And I am happy to talk with any community members about the Ward 1 seat, what the roles and responsibilities are. My email and phone number, along with everyone else's, is on the Northampton Public School website. And I just wanted to make that announcement. Thanks.
Thank you, Member Busanski. Member Kaufman, your hand is up next.
Sure, thank you. Like my colleagues that have announced so far, I also have decided not to run for school committee. December will be my 5th year, so I think that's a good run. I, like my colleagues, would certainly be more than happy to talk to anybody from Ward 6 that might be interested in running, and wanted to thank you all. We still have a lot of work to do, I think, between now and December, so maybe I'll share some final thoughts then. But at this point, I want to thank you all for your collegiality and teamwork and doing the best we can for our school district.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Lonnie, for those comments, Member Kaufman. The next person who has their hand up for an announcement is Member Condon.
I guess I will make it a hat trick and also announce that I unfortunately am not going to be running again for representing Ward 4.
Okay, Member Condon, thank you for your announcement this evening. The next member with a hand up is Member Goldman.
Thank you. I'm announcing that I am running for re-election for another term on the school committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Member Goldman, for giving us some positive news this evening. We appreciate that positive announcement. And obviously, thank you to my other 3 colleagues who've made the decision that they've made as well. So, any other announcements? Member Gold has his hand up. Member Gold.
It's not a hat trick, but I will concur with Kaya and say that I am running as well again next year. And so for at large.
Okay. Thank you very much, Member Gold, for your announcement this evening. Are there any other announcements? Okay. I'm hearing none. We'll then move forward on to reports and recommendations. You may recall that may recall that at the last meeting, we had a discussion about the preschool fees adjustments, but the meeting agenda had not been noticed that we would be taking a vote. So I'm bringing this item back. I'm hearing some background noise. I'm not sure where that's coming from, but I think I've muted. So there is now a properly noticed item on tonight's agenda to vote on the preschool fee adjustments as were presented by Erica Frank and Laura Frogamini at our last meeting. So I would entertain a motion to approve those adjustments as presented at the last meeting. Member Gold.
Motion to approve those adjustments as presented at the last meeting.
Member Condon, will you second?
Yes, I'll second.
Okay, so there's been a motion made and seconded. Is there any discussion or questions? I know we had a pretty good discussion at our last meeting about them. Hearing none, I will ask the clerk to call the roll.
Member Busansky,
Yes.
Member Seraphy Cox,
Yes.
Member Condon,
Yes.
Member Levy,
Yes.
Member Kaufman,
Yes.
Member Goldman,
Yes.
Member Voss,
Yes.
Member Gold,
Yes.
and Mayor Narcoitz.
Yes.
The vote is 9 in favor.
Okay, so that motion carries, and those adjustments are made. I see Laura here, so you're all set.
Thank you very much. We really appreciate the support in the Early Childhood Center. Thank you.
Excellent. So now we move to the main item on this evening's quarterly meeting, and that is a presentation by Dr. Provost on the mid-year screening results. So I'll turn this over to Dr. Provost.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. I wonder if I could request a ruling before I start. I have had a couple of members of the committee reach out to me to want to provide some education to the public on our recess mask policy. There is a letter that's going out to families tomorrow, but if it's in order, I could read one paragraph from that before starting, just to explain the mask situation.
I don't believe that there would be an issue with that. You're just making an announcement. We could have probably done it under announcements, really. So there's no deliberation, there's no vote. So I think that would be perfectly appropriate.
Okay, so thank you. So I'd like to take the opportunity to explain why we're continuing to require students to wear masks at recess at this time. Permitting unmasked, undistanced contact conflicts with the current CDC guidelines, as does the DESE recommendation to not quarantine individuals who come into contact with positive persons at recess. Our health department follows the CDC guidelines and as such would consider unmasked, undistanced students who were at recess with a positive individual to be close contacts and would require them to quarantine. So given the dynamics of a recess setting where there's no seating chart, you can't really give an accurate description of the potential contacts that occur over the course of even a 20-minute recess, allowing unmasked recess could easily result in quarantining many students and a substantial disruption to school operations. So at this time, we're staying with that policy as an attempt to keep all students in school. And so with that, I will move on to the main order of business, which is the quarterly meeting on student success. I'm going to share my screen now. Okay. As we were developing the FY22 budget, we made some recommendations concerning resource allocation based on anticipated need as revealed by our mid-year screening data. I shared just a few snapshots of the data at that time to provide a sense of where our greatest needs were found and where additional resources were needed. At that time, I said there was much more information that could be shared at one of our future student success meetings. Tonight, we can more deeply into the data, but let me reassure you before I start that I have no intention to go through all 69 slides and 238 charts and graphs that are included in your packet. That level of detail will be useful for school level data teams and will be available for members of the public who would enjoy fine-grained analyses of student performance data. Tonight, I'll be talking about the broad trends, pausing to discuss some results that are indicative of larger trends. If you have any questions about any specific slide or chart I may pass over, please feel free to bring me back to it for discussion. So we're going to begin with literacy skills and with our youngest learners. I'll take some time on this slide to explain the information it contains. There are many other slides with the same types of charts. So if you understand how this one is set up, you'll be able to interpret the others. The two pyramid-shaped charts at the top of the page are known as the tier transition. In any kind of a multi-tiered system of supports, there's also a universal screening system to identify each student's level of risk for learning problems and the corresponding support that would be appropriate. The risk estimates are based on composite scores, meaning that many individual measures were used to determine the student's overall level of risk for learning problems. So these pyramids show the proportion of students in each class assigned to one of the three levels of risk based on the results of multiple subtests. The first pyramid shows the risk levels of all kindergarten students in the fall for reading. The second pyramid shows the risk levels of the same group of students in the winter. A few students might have moved in or moved out between the fall and winter screenings, but other than those few exceptions, the two charts show the same groups of students at different points in time. Now, ideally, you'd expect to have 80% of the students in tier 1, the green tier, about 15% of students in tier 2, the yellow band, and about 5% of students in tier 3, the red band. If there are higher percentages of students in tier 2 and tier 3 in the fall, we'd like to see those percentages come down in the winter as students move from higher levels of risk to lower levels of risk due to our interventions. So two things jump out from this chart for me. The first is the very high number of kindergarten students identified at risk for learning problems, and the fact that by the winter screening, we're seeing more rather than fewer students in the at-risk categories. Kindergarten was unique, both in terms of the proportion of students at risk for learning problems and the fact that the at-risk group grew during the first 5 months of the year. There will be another pyramid here once all the spring data is collected, which will show whether this trend continued or reversed in the second half of the year as students received more in-person instruction. Below the tier transitions, you'll see subgroup averages for both Hispanic or Latino and white students on some of the individual subtests that contribute to the composite score. Other racial subgroups are not shown because they have fewer than 20 students in a grade level, which makes averaging unreliable. First, you see the fall and winter subgroup raw score averages. Then you see the corresponding fall and winter percentile ranks associated with those averages. Looking at the first chart, and this is important, you can see that both subgroups made progress. You'll see that time and time again as we go through these charts. On almost every measure, students made demonstrable progress. So I'd like to pause here and thank every teacher, every ESP, every school employee who made that progress possible. So you might ask, if we're seeing such progress for our students, why are we identifying larger numbers of them at risk? The reason is that the rate of growth is not what we would typically expect. You can see that from the second chart on the bottom, which translates the median observed scores for each subgroup into the corresponding national percentile rank. These were norms that were established in the pre-COVID world when the fall semester was 90 days instead of 80 days. As you remember, we shortened the school year by 10 days. All 10 of those days came out of the first semester. And when there were 5 full days of live instruction instead of 4 days and 2 hours on Wednesday. And there were also norms that were established when learning was fully in person. So our students' growth rates under the conditions I just named did not always match the developmental patterns of the pre-COVID era. Based on our data, I now consider it a misnomer to speak of learning loss. We don't actually see much evidence of a learning loss. Students develop skills this year, just not as quickly as we would expect. It would be more accurate to speak of a learning lag rather than a learning loss. The instructional challenge for us is not so much how to recover skills that were lost as how to accelerate student growth trajectories to get them back on track. So I'm going to move on to first grade. Moving on to first grade, we see some similar patterns. In this case, we don't have a tier transition chart for the fall because we try to be economical in the amount of screening we do with students. So not all the literacy subtests were administered in first graders in the fall. So there were no composite scores calculated. But again, you see raw score growth indicative of skill development with a negative slope and percentile rank showing that the growth rates were slower than those usually observed. And a larger proportion of the students are considered at risk for developing early literacy learning problems than we normally would like to see. As I said, you'd like to see that tier 1 representing 80% of the population. Here in first grade, tier 1 is 50% of the population, meaning about half of the first graders are at risk for learning problems in reading based on the winter screening.
Dr. Provost?
Yes.
Member Gold has his hand up. I think he may have a question.
Sure.
Yeah, Dr. Provost, sorry if I missed it in your initial explanation, but just because I know a lot of the slides are, I know we're not going through, you had mentioned we're not doing all of them, but they're a similar format. Is this a type of assessment that it's identical from the fall to the winter? Is this one that expands the complexity of the questions based on where the student finishes? So if they continue to get correct answers or they have more challenging questions, like how is if you could just give that little, it would be helpful to know if are we comparing apples to apples between the two tests?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. That's a great question. So this is a form of assessment known as curriculum-based measurement, and it's specifically within that known as progress monitoring. So with a progress monitoring system, what you want to have are multiple versions of an assessment of equivalent difficulty. So the questions don't get harder throughout the year. What you'd like to see is students being able to answer more of them with accuracy, and that's the real indication of growth. So it's like if you had a bar set at 5 feet, and every fall, winter, and spring, the task or the test was how many students could jump over the bar. You would like to see increasingly more of the students make that measure as a sense to show that they were all making progress. Does that answer the question?
Yes. So it's not like, for instance, the Woodcock-Johnson, where at some point, if the student isn't able to answer the questions, because what's happening is that we're seeing a drop in the percentile. So I'm just trying to better understand what that's referring to. You know what I mean? Like, is it like the Woodcock-Johnson where you keep taking, you can re-administer it and the student, you're asking a different question set, but you can go further into the complexity level, like first grade, second grade, third grade. Later in the year, you're expecting yourself to go further into it.
Right. So the Woodcock-Johnson is a different kind of assessment, and a part of that process is establishing what's known as the floor and the ceiling. And that's what you're talking about, students being able to go farther and farther to hit the ceiling. And truly, most versions of the Woodcock-Johnson measure from pre-K to 12, I believe, all on the same form. So that's not what we have here. The first grade assessment is different from the second grade assessment, is different from the third grade assessment. It's not the type of assessment that allows students to continue to show progress at a higher grade level than their current grade placement or a lower grade level than their current grade placement. What it shows is their performance relative to other students in the same grade. So to your point about how percentile ranks are falling, what just to look at this chart that happens to be on the screen right now, you can see that the fall score and the winter score for nonsense word fluency, which is the measure we're looking at right now, increased for both groups. So there was growth there. The percentile rank decreased. And the reason why is because the slope of those two lines of increase were not great enough in order to maintain the same percentile rank relative to their other students. So just to take the white students, for example, they started at about the 50th percentile, would be dead on average, and ended at the 40th percentile. What that's telling me is in order to stay at the same level that they were in the fall, this winter score would have had to have been higher. Does that make sense?
Yep. Yeah, that part definitely doesn't. Last one, then what again was the name of the assessment that's being used? Just it's escaping me.
Oh, great. So I think I missed that. So these are all the Ames web assessments that are part of our universal screening as part of our multi-tiered system of support.
Cool. Just good. Appreciate it.
Okay. I do want to take a minute to look at this chart. This is also first grade. This is word reading fluency. It's in first grade that we start to directly measure reading rather than prerequisite skills such as letter identification. I point this chart out because it shows something interesting about our subgroup data. In this one, you'll see several of our charts that show gaps between Hispanic and Latino and white students where they remain or get larger, but that's not the case here. So here is first time tonight. You'll see it a few other times. We see gap closing. The white students started at about the 50th percentile, which is right on target again for grade level expectations, and lost some ground. The Hispanic or Latino group started at about the 10th percentile, which is very low, and we're about at the same point as their white peers by winter. My hope is that the spring results would show that we see the gap continue to close and both of the groups move closer to the 50th percentile, which would be average for the grade level.
Dr. Provost?
Yes.
Quick question. So the students in the percentile that are being compared to in the percentile rank, are those from this year or from past years?
This is the percentile. They're being compared to the national percentile rank, which was established in 2011,
right,
based on a normative sample of over 10,000 students, I believe.
Okay, so we're not comparing other kids who were being educated remotely.
That's correct.
Okay, well, that's an important distinction, right? So our kids are growing, but we don't know, that would be a different chart, but we don't know if the growth that they achieved this year was even better perhaps than other school districts. We just know that they didn't do as well as kids in previous years based on the percentile.
That's correct.
Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome. So I will skip over second grade. You see basically the same kind of pattern in second grade. I'll talk about third grade for a minute. Third grade marks the transition from early literacy to reading. So you say that the name of these composite scores changed. From this point forward, you'll also see a new kind of chart that shows the district average composite score as compared to the national normative sample composite score. The dashed line shows the national average in the fall and winter. Again, to your point, these were norms that were established prior to COVID. So there's some really good news about the upper elementary grades, which is that our students started the year performing above average, even compared to pre-COVID norms, and we're even further above the national average when screened again in the winter. On these charts, I've also added notations for components of the winter composite score where our students were showing particular strengths or weaknesses. Here you'll see our oral reading fluency was a relative weakness for our students, but vocabulary was a relative strength. And you'll see that pattern as well. The oral reading fluency from year to year, it seems to be an area of weakness for us, and the vocabulary, an area of strength. From third grade on up, You'll also see the tier transition charts that look about right, with approximately 80% of our students in tier 1. So you can see here, that's like right on the money for what we would expect. And before I move on, just point out, here's an example of our strength in vocabulary. You can, whoops, I didn't mean to do that. You can see that the average student in the white subgroup was above the 75th percentile, which means that half of them were above even that, half of them were below, but still very high. And the average student in the Hispanic or Latino subgroup was right at basically the national average. So this is definitely a strength for us. Moving on to fourth grade. Fourth grade shows a similar pattern. Again, starting out above national pre-COVID norms and extending that lead. Again, showing the weakness in oral reading fluency, but strengths in vocabulary. I mean, there's a new measure that comes in fourth grade, which is silent reading fluency, and that also was a strength. And here are some of the sub charts. Again, you can see the tier transition looks good. 80% of the students in tier 1. And then, oops. Moving on to fifth grade. So in fifth grade, we see more of the same. And so I won't belabor the point, but those are the patterns. Even in fifth grade, the tier transition looks especially good. By the winter, we were only seeing 12% of fifth graders showing a potential risk for reading problems. So that's exceptionally encouraging news.
Dr. Provost?
Yep.
Could you potentially repeat why were the subgroup data is limited to Hispanic Latino?
Sure, because in each of the grade levels, in order to have a really to have enough of a group for an average to make sense and not be really skewed potentially by one or two very low scores or one or two very high scores, the sort of standard practice here is not to show subgroup averages for groups that are smaller than 20. And the other racial subgroups at our individual grade levels are all less than 20.
I guess so it's specific to race, not ELL, SPED subgroups, as like this data doesn't have that as well.
That it does have that. You know, I'm looking tonight with an eye to racial equity because that's been such a focus of the district, but you can break the data out that way as well.
Okay, appreciate it.
Mm-hmm. And you would have more than 20 in those subgroups to show at the grade level. So here's sixth grade.
Can I ask a question too?
Member Voss, your hand is up. I'm sorry, John. Member Voss's hand is up.
That's okay. Thank you. I'm just curious. It's kind of building on that other question. So we're seeing two subgroups, but I'm curious why we don't see a line that just includes everybody as well. And if we did see that line, or maybe what I want to know is roughly what percentage of the students are in each of these subgroups that you're actually showing us?
Well, it's a timely question. When you're looking at this chart that happens to be up right now, that is everybody. So that's all of the students in the grade level are included in the district solid line. When you look at just those two subgroups that I've been showing all along, the white subgroup would be approximately, for most of the grade levels, about 70% of the students in the grade. And the Hispanic or Latino group would be about 15% of the students in that grade. So obviously that doesn't add up to 100% because there are other groups that are too small to form a subgroup average, but they are reflected in this chart, which shows everybody. They're also reflected in the tier transition charts because the tier transition charts are not disaggregated by subgroups, so those include everybody. Okay, so moving on to sixth grade. Sixth grade reading also looked really strong. All three subtests given in the sixth grade were areas of strength for the district. You can see our line is well above national average. The trend is trending up with the national average, and maintaining that good positive gap for us there. Again, I'm just going to go to vocabulary. Again, you'll see vocabulary scores are off the charts. Here we have an example of how I'd like to see us close gaps. In the fall, the average vocabulary score for white students was at the 88th national percentile. And for Hispanic and Latino students, it was at the 60th percentile. Both groups are above average. And between fall and winter, the average score for students in the Hispanic and Latino subgroup increased to the 73rd percentile, while the white students stayed in the high 80s. So both groups were significantly above average by the time of the winter screening. For me, that's a picture of excellence and equity in education. That's the type of progress that I'd like to see us making across the board, not just in certain subtests and not just in certain grades. So seventh grade reading shows a little bit of a different picture. In seventh grade, we see some evidence of backward movement. I hesitate to call it regression because our seventh graders started the year well above average, and we're still well above average on the winter screening, although that positive gap was reduced. Still looking at the three subtests, reading comprehension, vocabulary, and silent reading, you still see most of the students above target. So it's hard for me to say that's regression. You can see where some of that came from, some of that backward movement came from. If you look at the silent reading fluency, as you see from the tier transition, only 11% of seventh graders are at risk for reading problems in the fall, and just 12% in the readers. In the winter. So again, it's showing, even though there is a little bit of that backward slide, really stronger than would be expected, even in pre-COVID times, reading performance. So eighth grade reading. On eighth grade reading, the student performance on the screeners was still well above the national average. The performance on the subtests that make up the composite were well above the average. As you can see, vocabulary, we only had 7% of all students in eighth grade miss the target. So really strong reading scores in eighth grade as well. When you look at the tier transition, again, you can see only about 10% of the students were at risk for reading problems in the fall or in the winter. Again, that's less than we would expect even in pre-COVID times. So it's good news on the reading assessments once you get past those first few grade levels. So switching to numeracy, which is, we'll call it early numeracy for young learners, and then we switch to math as they get a little bit older. So you can think of this all as math performance. Again, due to our desire for parsimony in screening, we didn't administer all the subtests in kindergarten or first grade that would be needed to obtain a composite score. In the subtests, we see a similar pattern of raw score growth from fall to winter, accompanied by declines in percentile rank, showing that new skills were being obtained at a slower rate than usual. We also continue to see a differential impact with the performance of white students in both fall and winter being slightly below average, while the performance of Hispanic and Latino students was significantly below average in the fall and even farther below average in the winter. Looking at first grade. On the one subtest we administered twice in first grade. Both subgroups of students were significantly below average by the winter, but both did gain new skills and make progress from where they started in the fall. On second grade, we start to have enough tests administered to see this kind of chart. So our second grade results are a little bit more encouraging. You can see that this group started the year right at the national average and starting to pull ahead by the winter screening. The only trouble spot was in the performance on concepts and application subtest. In my opinion, and this is just my opinion, but it's an educated opinion, this is a very important subtest because it measures the kinds of tasks that become more and more necessary for students to demonstrate mastery of grade level standards, especially as they advance in the grades. The other issue of note in the second grade was the growth of students at tier 3 on the transition chart. This means that even though the overall average for the class was increasing in terms of raw scores, the growth was not strong enough to, the growth of some strong students was masking another group of students who are falling further behind, because in the tier chart, you see each student score and which of the 3 categories they fell into. It's not an average. So if the average is moving up while the lowest group is getting larger, it means that some high performers in that green group are sort of overcompensating or masking some of the problems that we're seeing in students who are in tier 3. So we have to keep an eye on that. This also shows the subgroup performance on the concepts and application subtest. From this, you could infer that growth of students at the highest risk for learning is coming disproportionately from the Hispanic or Latino subgroup, because that's the group where we see them, more and more of them falling below the 25th percentile. It's really that range where we start feeling that students are at risk for learning problems. Anything between the 25th and the 75th percentile we consider more or less average. And anything above the 75th percentile we would consider to be above average. So seeing that group average, and remember, that's an average. So if the average score for the Hispanic and Latino subgroup on this subtest is below average, that means many of them are well below average. So moving on to grade 3. Third grade results are stronger still. So started out above average and increased that. I would point out number sense fluency as an area of strength for us. A lot of our interventions are based on increasing students' number sense because that has correlates with later math success. We still see diverging growth trajectories for racial subgroups in large proportions of the entire class at either tier 2 or tier 3. But we do see some evidence of students moving down the tiers from fall to winter. So in fall, 62% of students were in tier 1. In the winter, 68% of students were in tier 1. Again, we'd like to see tier 1 be at 80%. So we're not there, but we are moving in the right direction in third grade. So I think I will move on to fourth grade next. Fourth grade shows similar patterns. There's still a relatively large portion of students in tier 2 or tier 3. However, we're starting to see some narrowing of performance gaps between racial subgroups at this
Dr.
grade level.
Provost,
Yep.
member Gold had a question.
Sure. Sorry, I can't see the hands.
Yeah, no worries. Sorry, I didn't want to. Yeah. On the previous slide and all those that show us where we were able to get a, you said there's enough subtests to compare us as a,
This one?
Yes. I'm not asking you to take it out and find it tonight or nothing like that, but does AimsWeb provide, like we have with the DART system and the state accountability system, where we can look at like districts based on populations and income levels and all that, where you can kind of like compare yourself, rather than compare ourselves to the whole national average, compare ourselves to other districts like Northampton?
So I'm going to say I've been working with AimsWeb for more than a decade, and if that capacity exists, I don't know it. I'll just say that because I do find new things I can do with it all the time. But I've never come across that capacity. So this is compared to the national average. I don't know of any way within the program to chunk it down to say similar districts or Massachusetts districts or anything like that. All I know that I can do is show you our students' performance and growth in comparison to the national sample that was taken. And again, that's another thing. This sample is from 2011, so that doesn't update every year the same way the DART does. So this is sort of compared to a sample at a point in time.
Oh, wow. So that dotted line is not, this kind of goes to what Member Coffin was saying. I thought that was for the percentile ranks, but also for this one, that national average is not 2021 at all.
That's correct. And so I think, to me, that makes this kind of a chart look more encouraging because it's showing that our students, even with all of those obstacles that I mentioned earlier, with the fewer days, with remote learning, we're starting out above average and finishing above average. And to me, again, I'll just say that's another reason for me to sing the praises of all the work that was done by our educators this year to sustain that positive movement.
It would be interesting at some point to see, 2020 and 2019 combined, right? Because that could kind of let us know how we were from year to year compared to the national average.
Yeah, and we do have data for prior years. In fact, I've done that. I will say that we have never had as comprehensive as data as we have this year, because just knowing how long it had been since we had laid eyes on students when we were opening school, we wanted to make sure that we gave a more robust set of screening measures than we had in the past. So we don't have all of these measures going back for prior years, but we have many of these measures going back for prior years. So we could compare ourselves to ourselves in prior years, but it would be different groups of students, but it would be an interesting thing to take a look at. Okay. So I'll go to 5th grade. See, 5th grade is very similar kind of pattern. We still have about twice as many students at risk for math learning problems in the 5th grade as we'd hope to find from fall to winter. And so I want to point that out. I want to say, how does that statement square with this? How do we have averages that are above national average, but have more students at risk than above average? And it's because our performance is bifurcated. That's what that tells us. It tells us that when you put all the scores together, we're staying above national averages, but a larger and larger group of students are falling behind. That's just sort of being offset and masked by the high scores of students who are not falling behind. So again, here in 5th grade, we saw about 67% of our students in tier 1 in the fall. It was still 67% of our students in the winter. We did see growth, but it wasn't growth that was able to move the percentile ranks much. So the only way we can shrink the number of students in tiers 3 and tiers 2 is if we can, again, as I said earlier, find a way to accelerate learning. And this was, remember, this was the fall semester. The spring semester could look completely differently now that we have students back, but that's data going in right now. So that data set is not complete. This is our most recent complete data sets. Okay. I'll take us to 6th grade. And this is where things get a little bit different. So we saw some problems with math in 6th grade. And this reflects historical patterns we have seen on other assessments, such as MCAS for 6th graders in many years past. So here's a group where I would say we had what I would call real regression. They started out right about at the national average and ended up far below the national average. You can see the concepts and applications, which to me is a very important subtest 32% of the students below target, and the mental computation fluency, 45% of the students in grade 6 below target by the winter. Between fall and winter, the percentage of students considered to be at risk for learning problems in math in 6th grade increased from 32% to 40%. If this pattern continues into the spring, this will be something that warrants a special focus for the school and district next year, because that will be a lot of students who need acceleration. You consider roughly 200 students in a class. If 40% of them need acceleration, that's 80 students in 7th grade next year who need some acceleration. I'll move on to 7th grade. 7th grade results were better. Students began the year above average and grew at an above average rate. None of the subtests showed any particular weaknesses. The students showed a particular strength in number comparison fluency, which is a measure of number sense. As I said, a lot of our interventions are focused on number sense because it correlates with math success and other types of tasks. There were still many students at tiers 2 and tiers 3. So again, we have high performers there that are to a certain extent masking a group of low performing students when you just take the average. However, we saw students moving to lower tiers as the year progressed, and there was some evidence of narrowing performance gaps between racial subgroups. So you can see in the fall, we had 68% of students at tier 1. By winter, we have 72% of students at tier 1. Hopefully in the spring, that'll be even a higher 70s number, or even that 80% that we shoot for. Okay. And so moving on to 8th grade math. 8th grade math, much the same as 7th grade, shows many strengths as well. Concepts and applications, that one that I keep pointing out, is a strength for us in 8th grade. And I think that's a really positive indicator, as is the growth. When you look at this, as is the tier 1, again, we're not quite at 80% in tier 1, but it's only 74%. That's certainly a lot better than 60% like we saw in grade 6. And again, we see some evidence of closing achievement gaps, especially on this concepts and application subtest. So let me end my presentation by summarizing what I believe to be the takeaways from our fall and mid-year screening. 1, on almost every measure, students made progress during the first semester, with the exception of 6th grade math. There we didn't see that same kind of growth. 2, in many cases, the students' growth was not commensurate with learning trends that had been established prior to COVID. It's important to note that the combination of a later start to the school year and the Wednesday O days meant that students had 26 fewer days of live instruction during the first semester than they typically would have had. And I think that has a lot to do with the flattened trajectories we saw in the fall. Also, many of the live instruction that did took place remotely. The norms were set in a live teaching environment, not in a remote teaching environment. Based on reports from just about everybody, the in-person teaching for most students is more effective. So again, it's another thing that could have served to depress performance in the first semester. Number 3, we saw performance differences between racial subgroups. In some cases, the gaps increased. In some cases, they narrowed. In no case were they completely eliminated. Number 4, literacy development was negatively affected in the early grades, especially in grades K to 2. This is consistent with some national research that's emerging on the performance impacts of pandemic school closures, showing that our current kindergarten, first and second graders nationwide are having difficulties in not showing the normal developmental progression for reading acquisition. So I think the focus on reading instruction, reading acceleration, the additional supports we put in the budget to support elementary schools will help with that. I'll also add the Department of Education has just released a new set of studies on things you can do to accelerate student growth. And one of them is what they're calling focused after-school tutoring, which sounds a lot like the after-school instruction that we are planning to do in this budget. So I think we made a good bet there. And number 5, the last thing is that math development was kind of the opposite of reading development. Math was more impacted in the middle school grades. And this also is consistent with emerging research on pandemic closures, which is kind of telling the story that it's reading in the early grades and math in the later grades where we're seeing the gaps due to the shutdowns. And so I don't know if that's all I have for my presentation. I don't know if you wanted to leave this up to ask questions about any other slides, or if you'd like me to take this down at this time.
Member Levy, you have your hand up.
Thanks. My questions are not regarding the slides, so I'm okay if you want to take them down, but if others want them up, keep them up. Before I ask my questions, I just want to thank you that you clearly put a lot of time.
Member Levy, it's hard to hear you. Sorry.
No.
I don't know if it's just me.
For letting me know. Hang on. I appreciate that. I will do this and see if this helps. Better?
Now it is. Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. So, thank you, Dr. Provost. Clearly, there's a lot of time that went into this presentation, a lot of data to synthesize, and I really, really appreciate your putting in all of that time and effort. So my 2 questions. One is, I appreciate that we have already put into place some pieces that folks are recommending in terms of like after school tutoring. My questions are really about the reading for the earlier students and the math for the middle school students, and that is so one at a time. For the reading, what curricular adjustments are you recommending, or are you talking with the alt team or with teachers about to ensure that it's not like after school help, but it's actually built into the curriculum when we look at what needs to happen for our younger students and their reading?
So this may sound like an ironic answer to your question, but one of the things I'm recommending is that we not adjust too much, because one of the things that has come out of all of the equity research is that when students don't have access to grade level standards and grade level instruction, they can never make up the difference. So my hope is that we can provide literacy instruction for K1 and 2 as close as possible to the way we normally would based on pre-COVID years. Now, obviously, there's going to have to be more scaffolding. Obviously, we may have to do some more embedded supports, but I would like us to try to stay as close to our core curriculum and our core pacing as possible. And the idea that intervention should be another dose. So we don't want to remove students from that very powerful grade level instruction to receive an intervention, because then you're digging a hole with, on one, if we're going to be identifying a group who are struggling with reading and need additional support for reading, that should be a second dose of reading instruction that comes later in the day. So those are my 2 general pieces with respect to the question on literacy. My answer for middle school math is much the same. However, it's a little bit different in math. We have a math intervention, and one of the things that we've found from students who are in the interventions even before COVID is that one of the things that holds them back is not that they can't understand the grade level content. And that's why it's so important that they continue to have access to the grade level content. What's holding them back is they're missing some of the more basic number sense and more basic computational skills. So what's happening is they're making computational mistakes, or they're putting so much effort into doing the arithmetic part of the problems, they're missing sort of the higher math. And so for the middle school, the recommendation would be, again, make sure that the students are getting exposed to the 6th grade concepts, the 7th grade concepts, the 8th grade concepts. But if they have arithmetic or number sense deficits that are preventing them from efficiently getting answers, or if their arithmetic skills are such that they're starting to create an answer that obviously doesn't make sense, but they can't see it, to make sure that they get a second intervention that shores up those prerequisite skills so that they can get more and more efficient at accessing the grade level content.
Thanks. I guess a thought and then another question. I'm a little concerned, and I guess I would really love to hear from, obviously not right now, but perhaps in a future meeting, from your literacy specialists who are really working with you and working with teachers to really look at what's happening in the elementary schools, because I worry if we have, if we're starting here as opposed to here, and we just say, well, we're going to continue on the way we always have, then they're going to go up like this, and we're never going to have those lower students actually catching up. My question for math is, it sounds like this is a bit of a known issue in 6th grade, that this isn't new. And so my question is really, given that, what is our plan to really ensure there's the math supports? I mean, I guess my question is, when we see these gaps in the 6th grade, is that not an indication then that our elementary school math is not preparing students well enough for the 6th grade math that they are encountering? That it's not that necessarily we need to put those interventions in at 6th grade, although perhaps we do, but that we need to have stronger support so that they're able to apply those concepts when they get to 6th grade.
I understand the question, but I don't think that's the dynamic, because when we've had assessments that come close to the end of the year, whether they be MCAS or whether they be our own district assessments like Ames Web, we have found year after year the 5th graders are ending basically with the grade level skills we want them to have, as measured by the curriculum, not based on some kind of arbitrary standards. In 6th grade, we see some movement back on that. And then we saw that even with the data I showed today. So I do think that there's something, and I have had a conversation with Principal Caldwell about this. There could have been some things that were a factor this year. There was a long-term sub situation in one of the classes, but it has been year after year. So we have put together the data day. That's one of the things that was in the first part of our budget. And I've asked our colleagues from the Department of Education to focus on the middle school and focus on this data, running the staff through some protocols and helping to break it apart and trying to figure out what it is at 6th grade. I haven't been able to figure out what it is. And my hope is that with some more additional support from the statewide system of support, we can get a handle on it.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Would you be able to share a report with us once that has occurred so that we are updated on what has been found and what is then being done as a result?
Sure.
Thanks.
Okay, Member Kaufman has his hand up next.
Oh, great. Are you sure I'm before Ms. Buzansky?
I'm just going by the order of the hands.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. So I wanted to, okay, well, first of all, I'm in full agreement with the concerns that Member Levy brought up. So thank you for raising those. And I think those are just a second person who shares those same concerns, Dr. Provost. I also share her appreciation for the efforts that you put into preparing this tonight. For those of you that there was a little bit of confusion about what actually was occurring tonight. So I just want to retrace history really fast, that the previous school committee I think universally adopted these ideas that we would have on a quarterly basis, we would have a single focus on data. And it might have actually stretched into this group. I actually don't remember, but we looked at academic and non-academic indicators of success. And from my recollection, I think we looked at MCAS scores once. We looked at growth data, similar to what Dr. Provost shared with us tonight, measures that are given at different times during the school year so we can look at growth. We also looked at social emotional measures, and we looked at probably enrollment and attendance and other related data, although I don't actually remember that. And I see Dr. Provost shaking his head. So, I mean, the downside, of course, is that we're asking us to meet more often. We're also asking our educational leaders, whether it's Dr. Provost or Dr. Cheevers or the principals, to spend some time sharing these data with us. But I personally would love to get back into this. It's a focused agenda. It really gives us a lot of information that we can make decisions around. Somehow, I think we lost focus a little bit this year, maybe because of remote learning, but that would be something if you all endorse the idea of, I think we can get back into doing these next year 2 or 3 or 4 times. It's really a unique opportunity. So with that said, a couple of just really fast questions, Dr. Provost. I'm wondering, have these data been shared yet with our educators, and including the spring data that's coming in? Is that something that they'll have the opportunity to explore?
It hasn't been shared beyond the alt team at this point. As I mentioned earlier, I think this is the data that we're going to be able to talk about during the data day. So I've asked the SSOS to share with us the protocols they're going to be using with middle school so we can replicate that experience with data teams at the other schools, because this is what we have. You know, we won't have our even preliminary MCAS results by then. The old MCAS was, you know, the last one was 2 years ago at this point. So those are not relevant, you know, current data. This is what we have to go on, and that this will be shared with the staff.
Yeah, what's the data day?
In the budget, we approved a day for teachers to come in and after the end of the school year and work with the administrators and on developing a plan to move forward next year to really start accelerating students who need it based on what we've been able to determine from the screenings that we've done this year.
That sounds like a great idea. Was that my idea? I don't remember it.
I believe that was my idea.
Oh, okay.
I think it was actually Cammie's idea, to be quite honest, but I presented it.
Okay. So, I mean, do grade level team meetings still occur?
Yes, they do.
So wouldn't this be an ample opportunity to spend at least some of that time looking at how they did grade by grade for these 2 measures, as well as any other data that exists?
Sure. I mean, I can definitely share that with Nancy, who chairs those meetings. But as I said, this is kind of hot off the presses. Even though it's winter, you know, it's the first time it's been all put together and assembled in a package.
Yeah, absolutely. And the spring data will be great as well. But I mean, the teachers put in such a monumental effort this year. I wouldn't doubt if the spring data is better because teachers just got more used to what they were doing. And I also think there's some surprise. I expected everything to go down, especially comparing to national norms pre-COVID. So the fact that some of the percentiles went up and all of the scores went up almost universally, maybe not as much as in the past, is overall, I think, better news than at least I expected. So I think sharing that with the teachers would be a healthy conversation to have. And then my last question is there anything, seeing that we did have some success with the remote instruction, particularly in literacy and reading, is there anything that we could capitalize on in the future for days that students maybe miss school, or extended types of offerings that we can take advantage of, knowing that at least preliminarily was actually rather successful?
So that's something that has definitely been on superintendents' minds. You know, there was the whole idea of blizzard bags as an alternative to snow days, as a way of just keeping instruction going, which the Department of Ed had ruled was going to be, you know, basically not allowed anymore because of concerns about what students were missing during those remote days. But then, you know, there is evidence that we were able to do some good things. So, you know, the question has been asked many times. That the Department of Ed hasn't ruled on whether they'll allow this as an alternative to snow days in the future. But that's one thing. The other thing is, I'll just say this. there are some students who did not do well with in-person instruction who really flourished with remote instruction. Many of those were students with disabilities. Many of those are students, with school phobias or other things that made it very difficult for them to be present for learning. So, I would hope that we're able to continue to offer remote learning as an option when it makes sense for students.
Yeah. Well, their access to it, I don't know how many families would do this, but their access to remote learning should be pretty vast in the future. And if students that are behind and are interested in spending some more time, maybe making up for some of their experiences that they've had this year, would be another opportunity to do so. So I don't want to get into ideas. I just want to say that again, I appreciate what you did here. And I think some of the results are better than I expected. So thank you. And thank you for all our educators for doing everything they could this year to keep as many students as possible moving forward.
Thank you, Member Kaufman. Member Goldman has her hand up next.
Thank you. Yes, I echo appreciation for the work that went into putting this mid-year screening presentation together. The questions that I have based on the presentation is, one question is, we were talking, I think it was Member Gold mentioned comparing similar districts or the state, and you were saying you didn't have access to that sort of information, but can you confirm that these are the assessments that all the other districts are using, and that if I went to their school committee meetings with presentations, they would look similar?
So other districts that are using AIMSweb for screening would be using the same assessments. Now, I mentioned, if you recall, in some of the grade levels, we didn't have the pyramid charts because we didn't give all the subtests. So what happens is every year we reassess our screenings and decide which parts of the tests were helpful for us and which ones we want to give in the future. So schools can make individual choices. It's unlike MCAS where everyone has the same thing. But the amount of information you get is dependent on the choices you make about how many tests you want to give. So every district that's using this particular screening system would be giving a similar kind of, getting similar kind of reports and giving similar kind of presentation. There are other screening measures, and that's another thing we look at every year, which is, do we want to keep using AIMSweb or do we want to change to a different screening system? So far, we've always said just stay with AIMSweb, because when we look at the other screeners, they're almost identical to what AIMSweb is, and it's a system that we already know. Because these are the skills, these are the sub skills that predict success later on, and so that's what everyone is measuring. So the answer is, some people might have slightly different subtests. Some people might have different screening measures that have a different flavor of the same kind of test, but it would be, this type of assessment is very commonly done across the country.
Thank you. And would you say that in the past years that you've used this assessment, there hasn't been much focus or concern about that the national
We lost your audio, Kaya. Can't hear you, Kaya.
I'm not sure if she's frozen. Kaya, can you hear us?
I can. Can you hear me?
You kind of froze up for a second there. So
yeah.
Repeat your question, I think, maybe.
Sure. Would you say that, can you hear me now? Thank you.
Yes.
Would you say that based on what you presented tonight, there hasn't in the past
We've lost you again, Kaya. Your audio has gone out. Can you hear us, Kaya?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you just were on the cusp of asking your question and then it froze up again. So
you know what? I'm going to move to another room and I'll come back around. Okay, thank you. My apologies.
No problem. Let's go now to Member Busansky.
Thanks. So again, I'll just echo the appreciations that have been given already to you, Dr. Provost, and our educators. And I also, I guess I second or third Member Levy's points. I really appreciate those being made. Just a couple quick questions. Just if you could just remind me, is the tutoring, after school tutoring, is that K through 5?
Yes, it is. Yes,
Okay.
it's elementary.
So all of it starting in kindergarten.
Yep.
Okay, so I'll be capturing those students that need that kind of focused extra help.
Now we do already have tiered support interventionists in place, and so they may decide to focus on doing some of that work during the day for the younger kids. I mean, that can be a building-based decision, but they have the resources to do it either during the day or after school. We added the after school hours because we know that they can't capture all of these kids within the school day.
Got it.
So I hope my strong faith is that we're going to make the decisions based on what's most conducive to family schedules.
I see. And so you'd be able to tailor it to each child? Is that what you mean? Or you go with the...
Well, yes, I mean, the interventions we do. So again, in intervention world, there are two things. There's one called, very individualized interventions, and then they have like what's called the standard intervention protocol. We do something that's like sort of closer to the standard intervention protocol, but the groups are so closely matched. It's very well matched to the needs of the learners. So what I'm saying is, though, that some families might not be able to stay after school if they can't, regardless of the fact that we're providing a bus. My hope is that those families would use some of the during the daytime to take care of those kids.
Got it. Okay, thank you. And then I know you didn't break out the data this way, so it's a bit of an unfair question, but I'm just curious if you have any sense of how special ed students did when looking at this.
So I did not look at it that way, and I'd only be speculating. I don't want to do that. What I could do is, run some reports and get you some additional information if you'd like to know.
Yeah, that would be great. I feel like that would be helpful. And then my other question is how do we do this, or do we do this kind of screening for high school students? How do we know what their learning loss or learning lag has been?
So that's a great question. Right now, we don't have a system in place for the high school. The district improvement plan that we just approved the last meeting has an initiative to create some kind of a system for the high school. And so we have had some conversations about, how to start moving with that. It looks a little bit different at the high school because, it's course by course rather than just a grade. And that makes a difference. And students are on all different trajectories instead of taking the same courses every year. But there are some models out there, and we will be working on that over the course of this next district improvement plan.
So what, based on that information, what are you sort of recommending, or what's the approach going to be for the high school come September in terms of what the pandemic, learning loss or learning lag might have been?
So the most important thing, or I guess the best information we're going to be able to give them is the spring results of the 8th graders, because that will show them where their incoming freshmen are. We'll also have, by that time, the preliminary MCAS results for the 10th that the 10th graders took this year, so they're in 11th grade. So we'll have good data sets for those two grade levels. 10th grade and 12th grade will be a little bit of a mystery, but we'll just have to rely more on end of course grades and end of course assessments in the courses that they were finishing up the prior year to get a sense of where they are.
Got it. I'm wondering if there's any way, and just in the fall, to kind of open up with any kind of assessment, at least in just kind of the basic sort of reading, writing, math subjects that might be useful or to teachers.
So that's something I'd really have to talk to high school staff and administration about. It is possible, but I'm not sure that they're at a place where they're ready to do that yet. I think there's a lot of groundwork that needs to be laid because it is so different, and it's it's not a secret or an accident or, happenstance that we have this system K to 12, but we don't have it at the high school. Our screening system doesn't go, it ends at grade 8, and there aren't a lot of systems that are specifically designed 9 through 12. There are models out there though. And, I think the process that should be used is the high school staff and administration should take a look at some of the models that are out there and then pick the one that works best for them. I think if we try to get that in place for the fall, it would be rushing, and I don't want to do that.
I'm wondering if it's worth trying to gather from current year teachers any kind of just, qualitative data on what they feel like the experience, their sense with students, how they've progressed. So we could try to just capture some of that over the course of the school year.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things that standards-based should help us with. With a standards-based report card, we should be able to identify kids who've missed significant chunks of content or who, just haven't reached mastery on certain standards that could pose barriers for them taking the next steps.
And just remind me also, does the high school have a data day also? Did we put that in place in our budget?
Yes, we did.
So what data will they be looking at on that day then
So they'll be looking at the 8th grade for the the 8th grade end of year results for the 9th graders. And I believe they'll probably have to be looking at those end of year, end of course grades to try to identify kids who are at risk.
Okay, got it. Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
I wanted to just circle back to Member Goldman, who had lost her connection mid-question. And so I was just going to go back to you, Kaya, and have you finish that question.
Thank you, Mayor. So I guess my question is along the lines of the tutoring that will be available for acceleration. You said that there will be opportunity.
Oh, drat.
Maybe Kaya should put it, oh, there is no chat. That's right, never mind.
Yeah. Okay. Kaya,
Yeah. I'll send you an email.
I can hear everything in between. It's just what the moment you start to ask,
I know
it goes away. I'm not sure. Yeah.
My question is about projections about the demand for.
I'm going to try to guess. So I don't know. Was it demand for tutoring? Could you shake your head yes if that's it? I can't see your screen anymore.
Uh-oh. Okay.
Okay. Oh, there I am. Can you hear me?
Yes.
You're all frozen. No.
You.
Okay, great. When will the spring data set be available? And I'm wondering about projections for how much tutoring we need.
Excellent. So the spring data is starting to get into the system now. As I was running these reports, I could see that about 20 to 30% of the 8th grade assessments have been completed. So I would expect that to ramp up over the course of the next few weeks before the end of school. In terms of projections, obviously I'll be able to make better projections when that data is completely in. So again, I think that's another thing that it might be better for me to come back to you when spring data is fully in and say, this is what it looks like we have for intervention groups at the different grade levels, and also tell you whether or not the resources that we had put in the budget are going to cover it or whether we see any gaps there.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, the next person with their hand up is Member Gold.
Yeah, just wanted to going back to something that Member Levy was sharing, and Dr. Provost, you're regarding the 6th grade, and you're pointing to the deficits within the students and their foundational skills, and how that is impacting their sixth grade performance. I guess I would just ask what has Northampton done, and I forget if this has been a conversation before, what has Northampton done to allow middle school to understand, specifically around math, the standards and the instructional expectations for K through 5? There's such a divide from middle school to elementary that part of it, I think, can, then become potentially the teachers not necessarily understanding the strategies the kids come with, or do you know that they actually do, and then great. But if that's not, I know that's something that in other middle schools has been an issue, that middle school doesn't understand what elementary school is really doing. Very simple, off the top of the head example is that a lot of middle school teachers don't realize that the standard algorithm is not taught for division in 5th grade, and then you start 6th grade and they start teaching the standard algorithm. And so anyway, I wonder how that can impact the data, and what your thoughts are on that.
So before answering that, I want to just sharpen up language. I don't think I talked about deficits within students. If I did, certainly that wasn't my intent. I don't see deficits within students. If students are missing skills, I think it's because there's a deficit somewhere in our system that we're not teaching it at a timely way or in the right way or something. But I would never say because a student is missing a skill that, the deficit is within them. It's a problem for us to figure out and how we're doing our business, I think. To your question about vertical alignment, there is a vertical math team, and there has been a lot of work on trying to unify K to 12, and especially on the transition between elementary to middle, because that has been one of our questions, the very hypothesis you're putting out there. So we have had a lot of work between elementary and middle school math teachers. We've given time from the elementary math coach to the middle school math teachers to try to make sure that the coaching was the same, that the teaching methods were similar, that everyone understood where students were sort of being dropped off at the end of 5th grade, so that they were picked up in an appropriate point instructionally at the beginning of 6th grade. So we have tried that. I don't think that's what the issue is, but again, I can't tell you what that 6th grade problem is, which is why we're calling in the statewide system of support to try to help us figure that out.
Okay, thank you. Member Voss, your hand is up next.
Thanks. I have a couple questions that are a little bit different. I'll start with the first one, which is, if we looked at these data, if you had been able to include, say, the same plot from last year, do you have a sense how would it look different, and how different would it look? Does that make sense, my question?
Yep. I think that the main difference would be just in the availability of composite data. This year, we did many more subtests than we did in the past, as I mentioned, because we really wanted to get a good sense of kids. And so we don't have as complete data in the past. So that's the main difference, and that's going to make it hard to do year-to-year comparisons. We could probably do year-to-year comparisons on sub-test data, but not on the composites.
Sorry to interrupt. I guess I wonder, do you think the growth from the fall to the winter in a normal year for us kind of parallels the national growth, or do you think it is kind of similar to what we saw this year, or do we just not know?
I think the main differences were those K1 and 2 reading. If there was any hint of that kind of a pattern in the past, all kinds of alarms and red flags would have been going up. So I think that's the main difference. I think other grades and other subjects probably look more or less similar.
Okay, thanks. That was my first question. I guess I have a comment and then a more detailed question. My comment is, I think in the future, I would find it really helpful on plots like this if we could have like a box plot, so show ranges around each of these. and give a sense of what the spread is. And you alluded to that because you said, you know, it looks like it's higher, or, you know, but we have more people in this part of the pyramid. And I just think that would give us more insight, and it would be the same number of graphs. So that's just a suggestion. And then something we haven't talked about a whole lot in detail here is just the stunning difference between what I'll just call the red line and the blue line in all your plots. And the red line, if you look closely, is the subgroup of students who identify as white, and the blue line is the subgroup of students who identify as Hispanic, like Latinx. And I'm actually going to keep calling them red and blue line, and I'm going to say why. I worry there's lots of jargon for this, but stereotype threat is one of them. And I don't want to sit here and say one group performs better than another group and call it that. So I'm just going to call it the red line and the blue line. But I know we all care a lot about those groups, and they're really staggering different. And I guess I have a couple questions and comments about that. And one is, do you think those differences are that big every year? And I'm going to guess they might be.
So we have a very long history of significant subgroup differences in the district on not just these types of assessments, but on other assessments. And, you know, one of the things that I find to be sort of most distressing about the performance of, I don't know what color line it is, the subgroup we're talking about that doesn't perform as well is not only does it underperform our other group locally, but it underperforms the same group at the statewide average. So we have problems with the equity of instructional opportunity and outcome that we're providing in the district.
Okay. No, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, and I'm going to say, and that's in part why I highlighted those two groups. I've said many times, I think the real challenge here is to reduce or to increase racial equity in our student achievement.
Well, some of the things along this line that I was thinking about while you were going through the slides were, and I couldn't tell because they were not on the same page, and that's fine, but I wonder if you know, or if somebody, if it's worth replotting in a way you can see it. But does that, so it seemed to me that the gap was bigger in K1-2 generally, not maybe every year, than in the older grades. Is that, do you think that's accurate, or do you not know?
I would have to go back and look at them to either confirm or deny that.
Okay. I think that might be worth looking at. And if it is bigger, that's kind of, to me, a sign that it's a problem that starts before they arrive in kindergarten. And I mean, it clearly is a problem that starts before they arrive in kindergarten because the gap is there, right? And it actually looked to me like we were improving by the time we got to 3rd and 4th grade, but it might have just been that one year. I don't know enough of the data to be able to say that for sure. But it makes me wonder if this goes back to other things we've been talking about more pre-K access and improving participation in pre-K programs. And I don't know if that's part of the story or how we address what kids are able to do when they show up in kindergarten, but that's just something that your data made me think about. And then I guess I just want to leave it, this is just a comment and then I'm done. And that is, I think as we need to really think about ways to close that gap by bringing the blue group, which is the lower performing group, up to the red group, and not saying, let's just stagnate the red group, because I think we do that a lot. I think especially in middle and high school, and especially in math, our solution has been to kind of wait around for everybody to catch up. And I think that's wrong. I think these kids that aren't performing as well, and they're in both groups. If you did the box plots, you'd see other, both groups have kids that are struggling. I think the key is to figure out how to help them catch up much earlier. And I hope we can start thinking that way.
Well, I will just respond to that. The one slide I pointed out is the one that I said I think is excellence. I think this is a picture of how we should be closing gaps, was doing exactly like you said, that the red line was sort of a flat going across the top, but it was a flat going across the top above the 75th percentile, which is extremely high performing. And the blue line was coming up to meet that. So that, I guess I'm just saying I agree with you. The idea is we want all student groups to be moving forward and the ones that are farthest behind to be catching up fastest.
Okay, Member Seraphy Cox, your hand is up next.
Thank you. So first of all, I want to echo what Member Kaufman was saying about how these numbers are not quite as scary as one may have thought was possible when looking at the sort of academic year that we've had, full of chaos and uncertainty, changes um, and more changes. So I then also want to echo what Superintendent Provost was saying about how much this speaks to both the professionalism of our district staff and their ability to work together, because with all those changes comes the real need to come together to support students. And I have seen that even more this year that my child has been home. I used to just send her off to school and then she would come home and I wouldn't necessarily know what was happening. But this year I've been able to see more of that, the handoffs that happen between teachers, the network of support that teachers are providing to students, and that's been incredibly. That tells me that this data is because both our district educators, as well as students in this district and families in this district, rising to the occasion. So that's my little spiel. And then the other thing I wanted to say is that I very much want to echo Member Busansky's request for information about special needs students relative to some of these measures. You mentioned, Superintendent Provost, that students with disabilities sometimes were able to thrive in the remote environment in ways that they weren't able to in person. And I think it would be interesting to kind of to see how students overall did, because I think that that's primarily an anecdotal experience, which I have also heard of on both sides, though, of that I've heard students with disabilities also having more difficulty because of the different types of sensory input. So I think understanding the picture about students with disabilities would be really helpful for this district as it continues to try and implement both the WINS model and strive for an inclusionary way of educating its students with disabilities. And then also just as to better understand some of the tools that are at our disposal that could even continue to exist during in-person school. My daughter has dyslexia, and the ability for her to utilize talk to text right there from her computer has meant that writing went from being her least favorite subject in first and second grade to now her favorite subject in fourth grade. So, she's writing essays about climate change. So utilizing some of those technological tools that we were accelerated into using because of the remote environment, can they maybe now be implemented in the classroom in a way that we hadn't seen before? So then my question with that is, do you have thoughts on when you might bring information like that back to us?
So next month, I just want to point out, has a very long, it has a presentation that probably is a similar length to the number of slides tonight, but one that I can't fly through as quickly. So I think that doing it in June would not be conducive to anyone's sleep or being able to really think about the information, but possibly in July or August.
Yeah, I think that would be good to have it be before the beginning of the next school year. And I mean, probably, yes, it's important for the school committee to see it. Probably what's more important is for the alt team to be digesting that information and for it to somehow be integrated into those data days that you are doing at the various levels. So. And of course, then think, with the alt team to think about how this data then might affect budgetary decisions for how to utilize the next, what is it called, ESRI, the recovery funds from the federal government, as well as just future budgetary decisions in general. That's it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Member Seraphy Cox. I don't see any other hands up. Are there any other comments or questions for Dr. Provost? Thank you, Dr. Provost, again for your presentation tonight. And this was the only item on our agenda this evening. We have the aforementioned future meeting on June 10th, Thursday, June 10th at 6:45. We have a retreat on Thursday, June 17th, 2021 at 6:30. And then our next regular school committee meeting on Thursday, July 8th, 2021 at 6:45. If there are no other, Member Voss.
I'm sorry, I realized I did actually have a just very general, specific question about the data you showed us. Did all the students in each grade take these tests or were they allowed to opt out? And also, when you say fall and winter, can you just give us a sense of when you think the tests were done? Sorry, I meant to ask you that earlier.
Sure, it's close to 100% participation. I have heard stories of a couple of families requesting to opt out in the spring assessment, but principals have been talking to them about the importance of this data. So I think it's going to be really close to 100% all the way through. So spring and winter, fall and winter, we're talking about September and January.
Thank you. I'm done. Thanks.
Well, would you like to make a motion, Member Voss?
I would love to make a motion. I move that the meeting end. What am I supposed to say?
Okay, so there's a motion to adjourn. Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, I will ask the clerk to call the roll on the question of adjournment.
Member Seraphy Cox.
Yes.
Member Condon.
Yes.
Member Levy. Did I miss your? Yes, okay. Member Kaufman.
Yes.
Member Goldman.
Yes.
Member Voss.
Yes.
Member Gold.
Yes.
Mayor Narkowitz.
Yes.
And Member Busansky.
Yes.
The vote is 9 in favor.
Okay, so the motion carries and the Thursday, May 27th, 2021 meeting of the Northampton School Committee is adjourned. Thank you, everyone.
Good night, everybody.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.